Really good. Right now we have Mr. Maurice O to give us a brief presentation about the Hawksbill Creek Agreement and regulation. Please show us some love as he comes up.
Evening. When I was asked by Pastor Victor to make this contribution this evening, he did not tell me the kind of meeting it would be, or in fact that you have decided that this is part of a campaign. Nor did he tell me that I was being asked to say a few words on condition that I say nothing about the power company or indeed the Port Authority. But it seems to me, and here I must beg to differ from the previous speakers, except maybe for Mr. Johnson here, because he's given some details. These are the things we normally run away from. And at the risk of appearing to be perhaps too Methodist for some of you who might be of a different persuasion, I do believe that whenever you look into the future, you see your past. I do not accept the proposition that the past has nothing to do with your future. Your future, my future, is done. Except you understand some very fundamental things. Everybody's talking about the high cost of power. Nobody is asking how did it get to be so high. You could look at diagrams on the tariffs and all of this stuff that Mr. Johnson has produced for you. All that is good, because I'm going to ask him for a copy of that. But there's nothing new under the sun. In October of 1992, the year that the F&M government came to power, a group of us, licensees, because by then I had become a licensee of the Port Authority since about 1980. Now go back to 1980, because when I came to Grand Bahama, one thing was evident. This place was being liquidated. It's to the end of the process here. And the question is whether or not you can bring an end to it and reclaim it. We are always so very grateful to have so-called foreign investors, because we're stupid. We're always being convinced to purchase our own apples, because we're stupid. Understand this. The Hawksbill Creek Agreement of 1955 and the subsequent agreements of 1960 and 1966 all were the bedrock of something which we in law call a trust. Never mind when you hear people talking about it belonged to Wallace Groves and then it became owned by Sir Jackson and such nonsense. We have always found ourselves in a problem of being strangers in our own land. And that's because we are often too giddy to understand what's going on around us. Let me bring you forward just a little bit and I will answer the question why it is that the power is high. Sir Johnson referred to 1993. And you'll recall that was the year when miraculously, someone found out that the Port Authority had a company called Freeport Power, which was owned by another company, which had shares, which could be sold, on the IPU would produce over $100 million, or whatever the sum is. The fact of the matter is, there was no such company. Someone had come along and suggested to the Port Authority that this was a way, because by 1993, as I said, from 1980, probably was before that when I came here, it was in the process of liquidation. Because I remember making the observation once that when I come here, the last significant piece of construction that had gone on was the towers. Those of you who understand Freeport will remember that until a man by the name of Abe Gould came here and was able to convince Mr. St. George to build what is Fort Okaya, which was supposed to be Bourbon Street, and the Region Center, there was nothing going on in Freeport. That's true. Nothing. Now, I haven't gotten to the point yet of who owns Freeport. Because you can talk about praying, and I pray. I am from that kind of a background, but I'm Methodist. You won't often see it. When, in 1955, Sir Stafford Sands put together this thing called the Hawksbill Peak Agreement, he wasn't stupid. In fact, Sir Stafford understood fully that you could not give away sovereign crown territory to strangers. It was always owned by the people on the land. But he worked out a very neat agreement, which in fact was designed not to develop Grand Bahama, not to develop this little area called Freeport. If you read the letters of instructions that were given by the Governor General to the Royal Commission, it was really to understand why it is and what it was about this development of Freeport, which was supposed to benefit the entire Commonwealth of the Bahamas. This is not a Grand Bahama thing. It is not a Freeport thing. But you have a trust here. And I'll tell you how that trust works. And I'm skipping about because I know I have a very short period of time. You'll recall, back in 2006, there was a major fight that developed between the estates of Mr. St. George, soon after he had died, that is, his children, and Sir Jack Hayward. The fight was over whether Sir Jack, as he was defending the claim, was in fact owner of more than so-called 50% of the Port Authority. The fight started when the members of the estate of Mr. St. George were claiming that Mr. St. George was a 50% owner of the port. Now, I know from the time I came to Grand Bahama, that was never the case. That Sir Jack was always something in the neighborhood of about 84% ownership of the port. I never was involved in the fight initially because the one lawyer who was in a position of having all of the secrets with respect to both men decided upon a gambit that he could run, and for a while he ran well, and you won't see him here tonight. And he was able, after representing both men, both factions, and getting huge sums of money out of the port, to decide that he was going to represent one of them against the other. And I remember having the conversation one afternoon, they came over me to solicit my help. And I said, but how can you do this? I said, this is not what we have taught in law school. You have to stay neutral. Because he wanted me to be what was called a soliciting attorney, because he was about really to descend upon the headquarters of the port and seize the records and all of this stuff. Of course, he was representing the St. George's clan. And I understand his frustration. He thought that when Mr. St. George passed, he would become the new prince. And it wasn't to be. But anyway, it went on. And he was able successfully to get some receivers appointed who moved into the Port Authority for more than a year, taking out huge sums of money. That's what they call receivership payments. and they were going back and forth, and nobody could get any of these orders that he was able to get successfully from a certain judge in the Supreme Court. Nobody could get to set it aside. Meanwhile, it was going crazy. So Jack was going into Cayman and getting lawyers and bringing, and they were going back and forth and back and forth. And somebody must have thought about the stupid idea of asking Maurice what he thought of it. And I said, well, it's a simple matter as far as I can see, but you've got to be able to get into the court and get that judge either to pay attention to you or to have her removed. Because it was a basic proposition. Nobody appreciated that the Port Authority as a company was not a regular company. It was not a company that was amenable to processes like liquidation and winding up and receivership. It is in the nature of one of those very special companies which Parliament has declared it will give things to do in the public interest, and for as long as those things are left to be done, this company will stay alive. In fact, there's some companies, one or two, that are still around now that some of us might not even be aware that they are companies of this type. There's a company called the Hudson Bay. Those of you who are Canadians remember there's a Hudson Bay company which used to traffic initially in pelts and seals, and even to this very day, it owns extensive real estate in New York and in Canada and along the Great Lakes. And then you had something called the East India Company. Well, the Grand Bahama Port Authority, the company, was just really an image of that. And what happened is that this was really a trust. So what I said to them is simply this: I can get the receivers out. I can get them out because they do not belong there. This is not a company which, because of the public purposes which have been assigned to it, can be put into receivership. Could not be done. It's an impossibility. We were successful, but we were only successful after we made an entry with a certain judge, because I was able to have her refuse herself, remove herself from the case. She'd become an impediment. The rest is history, but only after having lost so much money. And every time the port spends money, either for Mr. Edwards and George's stables, horses, you pay for it. But as I said to you, it was a process that went back, goes back from before he came to Freeport in 1980, and I saw it going on. Now here's the problem in 1993. When miraculously the idea came that there was a company coming in here called Southern Electric. And when Southern Electric came here, I got a group of licensees together and said, listen, I've read the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, I'm familiar with it. But one of the more important documents, those of you who are interested in history, a document which comes in the form of a report of the Royal Commissioners, which was produced and presented to the governor of the day on the 31st of March, 1971. So that is now 42 years ago that body of recommendations were put together. The group of licensees I got together, and I can go through it very quickly with you so you'll understand that there's nothing new under the sun, wrote a letter to the then new Prime Minister, Cuba in October 1992. And as you can imagine, I probably had a hand that flashed again. Well, I did. I wrote it and somebody signed it. But it was a group of licensees. And I'll just read part of it so you'll understand that this here, what you're talking about, has a root somewhere else. And whilst I will not tell you not to go on with your approach to the resolution of this problem, one of the things you would have to understand is that the power company was never, ever intended to be a profit center. That's right. It was never intended to be a profit center. One of the amusements to so-called licensees coming into Grand Bahama from the very beginning was that you would have, in addition to some of these other so-called concessions, and by the way, each of you who is a licensee, you have the same rights as a port authority under this agreement. Many of you don't even realize that. That's right. The only difference between you and them is that the port, in fact, was given, and this tells you the nature of the trust. When the government said to Mr. Wallace Crew, said they'll do this together, but remember now, this agreement is not between the so-called government and the in Wallace and Row. It's really people. It's an agreement signed by the governor on behalf of the Indian people. And what the governor says, so we will give you so many hundreds of thousands of land to get this thing going at the price of what? $1 an acre? This is the way you set up a trust. You endow the trust so that the trust can perpetuate. And depending on the length of time that the trust is to develop and to go into renewal, you continue to make sure that it is alive, it is a living thing. So when Mr. Smith went and put the port in receivership, he didn't understand that it had a life independent. That is why the agreement goes to 2054. It meant that nobody could touch that company before 2054, and those purposes had been achieved. But here's something else that Stafford understood. That was a nonsense as well. Because people won't suddenly all die and go away in 2054. You and I might not be here. And here's what he provided for in the agreement. He says at some point in time, when 4/5 of you licensees agree, you can go to the Port Authority and say, I want you to transfer over to a new body corporate all of your responsibilities, all of your rights and powers under the Hawksbill Agreement. And this new entity, which will be a public entity, this is in Clause 4.2 of the Agreement of 1960. As well as all of the license arrangements, the agreements, they will continue after 2054. The port, you can still stay here if you're a company. But there will be something called a transfer agreement. In fact, let me read it to you. So I can put my hand on it real fast. But let me talk to you as I go along, because I wanted to make the point about this so-called agreement. So in 1993, when suddenly a lot of people were thinking about buying shares in ICDU, because that is the company which supposedly owned shares in the Port Power Company. It was never a Freeport. Freeport Power started out as something called the electrical department of the Grand Bahama Port Authority. That's all it was. It was the electrical department, which they then incorporated into a company. And when each year, those returns, those of you who got companies and know that you've got to make returns to the registry, when the returns were made for the port group of companies, Freeport Power was just one of them, like all of the others. Somebody thought about this idea. Let's find something that we can get and suddenly make this really, because now they were really in the process of liquidating and mining. And so they were gleaning, they were taking everything that they could find. And here's how it came. The families between them were able to reach over $100 billion. I'm trying to remember what exactly, I'm trying to remember the exact amount of money they reached on the IPO. Someone went to Sir Jack right up front. Others then went to the family of the St. George's. Now, in all of this, now remember, the fight was whether there was an ownership of the Port Authority, 50-50 between Edward and Sir Jack. But in all of this since 1968, the Bahamas government, and if you go to the company registry, it owns 7.5%. Unless there's something called a 107.5% company, It makes no sense. They were only fighting over 92.5%. And all the returns declared this to be the case in the company's registry. This is still the case. Even the documents which were filed on behalf of Mr. George's now, when they showed you the company return. This is up to November 2006, you know. You're not going to talk about 1993. 7.5%. It came about this way. The government purchased, like to tell you exactly how much they paid for it, because it's all set out in correspondence that came before the committee. But what happened in 1993 meant this. That suddenly now you have shareholders. And what do shareholders expect and look for? Dividends. The dividends must come from somewhere. And then, I forgot to tell you the trustees of this trust now. The trustees are really the government and the Port Authority. They're just trustees. They're there for the time being. This is why, when Mrs. Groves became persona non grata, he can just simply say, well, this is my company, I'll wind it up, I'll leave it for Gordon, Graham, Gail, and what's the other son name? I should remember them because they grew up with them in Berry Island. Gary. He didn't say this is my company for them. No. He packed it after other people came in, and the same will be for these here. This is not a private-owned company. It is a company which is controlled and by agreement by persons who were able to exploit it beneficially for themselves and for the people of the Bahamas. To this end, that at the end of the day, you will develop this area called the port area. And in exchange for that, here's what I will do for you. You will be permitted to bring in fuel, bulk fuel, duty-free, on the condition that the power that you create, the electrical power, is limited to the port area. That's an agreement. Until 1993, all those little enterprises you see who were operating under licenses from the government, under the Island Electricity Act, that Mr. Johnson will be able to tell you, they were purchasing from Freeport Power. Now, here I got to give Mr. Johnson some of the blame for this. He was talking about how he was instrumental in coming up with the name around Bahamas. He didn't realize that was all part of the scam. Because when you give this company this name, this name makes it appear to be island-wide, Grand Bahama Power Company, you give the impression that it is a legitimate company, it's carrying out legitimate work. But here was what had to be done for that to be done. The port had to agree that you will extend electricity to those people to whom, as a central government, I am obligated to provide electricity in a modern Bahamas, on the east end, on the west end, and to the extent that it comes with a cost, you licensees and Freeport and consumers, you will subsidize it. So the price which ordinarily the government would pay, and for the time being it was prepared to license out to companies like West End Power Line for a fee. And they would purchase their from West End Power Line. Some of them, when they sold West End Power Line, I mean, they made little fortunes. Because the owners of this new entity were glad to have the protection that they needed from the governments, because they now co-opted your government into allowing them to provide services which was really the responsibility of the government. But, and I don't want to appear to be cruel for those of you who are from West End and from East End, but I have no business paying for your electricity. That's not my problem. So here you have an entity which now has to produce electricity for the outskirts, but it must also make enough income to pay its shareholders the dividend. all of a sudden now you've got really an entity which must become a profit center, when in fact it never was. So Mr. Butler's costs will go up. Those of us who've been running a business and can look for reasonable rates and understand too that even in terms of being able to replenish your plant, there may be a little bit packed in there so that at the end of the day, you can replace all of your machinery that is becoming outdated and worn out and for modernization. You can accept that. So you will understand that there will be incremental increases. But not now if you run a business. You have to pay $1,000 a month for that. That's a small business. And you have a home. And you will have to pay $1,000 a month for electricity. When before, you could have gotten away for the entire month between $400 and $500 between both. Not so anymore. And so this thing about praying until you see the rates come down, well, I will not be on my knees with you. Because it's not going to work like that. We've been stupid. We've been bad stewards. We have to understand that what we're being asked to do is to purchase that which we already own. You have to go and say to the trustees, and I'll tell you what the effort was. Mr. Seattle does remember that I put together a company back in 2006, which was supposed to be a non-profit company. And when the Attorney General got wind of it, they refused to grant me that status. I have all of the papers, I already paid my company's fees. They still have the money for me. Because we understand relations in this town. It was really to begin to call for the Port Authority to turn itself in and to turn everything over to what would be a municipality. That's what Freeport ought to have been right now. With its own tax base. With its own tax base, which would meet educational needs, health needs, and we would not be living hand to mouth. What is happening is that we will continue to have these prices go up. And you're not going to have a business tomorrow, I'm afraid to say. And some of us who can't leave here because our homes are here and we're old now, this is where we're going to die. The rates will not come down. Under the agreement, there should be only one entity. Here's something very peculiar about this thing called utilities. Only the Port Authority should own it. This nonsense about being separated from what they call the productive services from the regular, that is absolute nonsense. Let me read to you a letter dated the 14th of September. This is also this is part of the report of 1971. This is a letter written, I think then Bolton Bethel was the cabinet secretary was somebody called Foley Newens. Those of you who were around long enough to remember the name Foley Newens. He was the cabinet secretary. Remember now, he was still in pre-independence. It's 1971. Mrs. Groves had come across some new people to come into the Port Edge. This is where they were trying to get the Haywardsvilles in here. And under the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, the government had a first option of refusal because the government wanted to maintain that the only person to own shares here would be, and it was never in the name of Wallace Groves, by the way, it was really in the name of Georgette, his wife. So she sent these notices to the government. They say, listen, we have a potential purchaser and purchasers, and under the agreement, we're supposed to give you notice to purchase for us to exercise your option. But if you do that within a certain period, we are free to go ahead. And there was a great cabinet discussion and debate, and finally the agreement was reached. And they also then wanted to resolve the Medgate crisis that they were facing. Here is what was written back to them. So Foley Newens wrote to the Port Authority. This is a letter dated the 14th. I've never seen the original letter, but it's set out. It's really among the papers which the commissioners put together an appendix to their report. says, reference is made to the course of recent negotiations between your companies and this government. This is to inform you that the government has received from Mrs. Georgette Groves of Freeport the Abaco Lumber Company Limited, because that was really the company that developed Freeport and was owned by Wallace, and Variant Industries Limited. Variant Industries, those of you remember, that was a company owned by Sir Jack, it still is, and the Haywood clan. We received purchase notices respectfully given in terms of the agreement dated August 4th, 1955. That was the date of the initial agreement. 6th of June, 1958, and May 28th, 1958, between the government and those particular shareholders. The purchase notices were served on the government on September 5th, 1968. I am to inform you that the government is prepared conditionally to waive the options to purchase the shares in Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited, now held by those three shareholders, which have arisen in the government's favor upon service of those purchase notices, and to give its consent to the exchange of shares of the company for the shares of Bengay Consolidated Incorporated in the manner set out in the agreement and plan of reorganization dated May 15, 1968, annexed to each of the said purchase agreement. And then it goes through the Bengay exercise of this, and I go down further. A condition upon which this waived consent will be accorded would be that the Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited and Bengay Consolidated Incorporated undertake with effect from November 1st, 1968, that the various powers hereinafter enumerated arising in favor of the Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited in virtue of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement referred to above shall be until further notice exercised strictly in accordance with the stipulation hereinafter contained. A. The right to exclude any person or vehicle from any of the private roads and bridges within the port area, as that term is used in those agreements, arising under Clause 215 of the 1958 agreement, shall be exercised only after specific written concurrence of the minister in the capital of the islands, of the Bahama Islands, has been first obtained. And let me skip to the one which is really relevant for you. C. That before any new rates are imposed or changes are made in the existing tariff of rates and charges for the utility services operated under the Hawksbill Creek, under the authority of Clause 221 of the 1951 agreement. And that clause had given the port the exclusive right to operate utilities. And the Royal Commissioners interpreted to mean this, that it was something which the port could not pass on. In Maryland, in fact, it's an illegality under the agreement, ought not to exist. And then he goes on, he says, before any new rates are imposed or changes are made to the existing tariff of rates and charges for the utility services operated, that would be the end one. The Grand Bahama Port Authority will first submit proposals to an appropriate minister of the government and shall not introduce such new rates or changes without prior written agreement of the minister. We have always been under that. That has not changed, except though it's not executed. This is 1968. How many years ago that is? 45 years ago. We, in fact, have been under a regulation by agreement from back then. And that was in exchange for some favors which the government gave to the port. So what you see, all of this, the emeritus and all of that is nonsense. You should read the letter which we had put together to the Prime Minister expressing our concerns. And I will sort of finish because I know it's rather long and I've been here more than a few minutes that I've been allotted. But this was not really to say to Pastor Victor that the method that you have decided upon and the agencies upon which you've come here tonight ought not to be pursued. What I want you to appreciate, though, is that you are giving up on a claim, which is your birthright, legal birthright, and you don't have to go looking for it in old generation papers. It's right there. The idea is to call for the return of all, they've already got away with your money. And I'll tell you something else about America. Most of you might not understand this. There's a new provision under the Securities Industries Act, and I will bet my life on this, that there are less than 50 shareholders in this new entity. And I'll tell you why, because there's a new provision in the law which says that any company, even if it's a private company, and suddenly your shareholding exceeds 50 persons, 50 shareholders, it becomes a public company. Ask the operators of Bahamas First Insurance and some of these other. Once you've got more than that, that's what you convert it. So I would suggest this. So Jack and those, having gotten their money from the IPO and subsequent sales, are now into the secondary market, and they probably own interest in the new entity that they were able to float again to get money. But because it is in number, that is, in terms of the shareholding is a number, less than 50, you will never know. You don't have to disclose it. See, we just don't seem to understand how these things work. And you only have to band together to say, listen, and the answers in the Hawksbill agreement, you know, not outside, it's in the agreement. Go back, and the agreement is a good one. Never mind people telling you otherwise. It is a good agreement. So Stafford Sands did not set about to, he was a greater patriot than most of the people around here. Because here is what we said to Mr. Ingram at the Times. I said, dear sir, the undersigned writes on behalf of the membership of the Freeport Licensing Association. The association apologizes for having to impose their concerns on your office for this lengthy missive, and hopefully it will be apparent from the contents hereof that the nature and seriousness of our concerns justify the imposition at this time. And we knew he was a new Prime Minister, and he was newly. I'll tell you what I found out from another colleague of his, what he did with the letter once he got it. But you got to say this in paragraph 3. To the extent that the complaints of our members can be conveniently summarized, it covers at least 3 aspects. On the one hand, there is the special and selective patronizing of principles of the Port Authority by their own hands at the expense of the integrity of both the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, hereinafter the agreement, and the interest and economic well-being of licensees. Too often this is achieved in ways reflecting incestuous self-dealing and preferential treatment, often in situations amounting to blatant conflict of interest. A second aspect is the increasing personalization of those interests, rights, privileges, and franchises, which in the letter and spirit of the agreement were clearly intended to accrue for the benefit of licensees and at the expense of the public at large. And at the time, I didn't realize that it suddenly had gotten to be so fashionable and fooling behavior that they would come up with a company called PGL. Yes, PGL. PGL suddenly appears on the scene and finds itself owning all kinds of estates. And of course, when you look at the vehicles that PGL runs about the port area, it's the same colors, the same emblem. You have to look real close and recognize that it is not exactly that of the emblems for the Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited. But PGL, Port Group Limited, is a play on the terms which you would see whenever there was old correspondence in relation to the ports companies, called the Port Group of Companies. And I've seen letters that went to the central bank, the governor's central bank, and to other important people saying that this is a private company, and so therefore, you'd be surprised to know how valuable tracts of land were transferred into that company for a stamp duty of $10. You don't understand the massive raping and looting that's been going on in this place. And some of the people who were writing these, no doubt as employees on instructions, were behaving. They look like me and you. They're now in Wisconsin, the Chamber of Commerce, and so-called leading an end. It's a waste of time. They've sold you out a long time ago. Your prime ministers, the ones you go out and spend every 5 years, all hours in the hot sun before you can, get the vote. Yeah. And these are some of the things. A third aspect, which appears to follow logically from the other two, is the systematic liquidation of the Port Authority. This is 21 years ago. This is nothing new. And as I said, the Commissioner's report is 42 years ago. We just have been sitting on our duffs and we can't seem to get together. And you can only do it through the legal process, Yes. You're not going to appeal to heartless people who are not like you.
That's right.
They're not going to listen to you. The Sarah McDonald's. The other day they brought in this one to be chairman. Could not be. The real reason he was here as chairman of the port was because he had messed up on Sir Jack's trust, the family trust, which had Sir Jack children, so he's a Jack. And they had pilfered it to pay some of the legal costs of the same action. So he came in for a while to be chairman, and everybody looked at him to see what great utterances will come to save Freeport. Utter nonsense. Utter nonsense.
My God.
Because the board of the Port Authority by now ought in fact to be controlled by licensees.
Yeah.
And when we wrote to Mr. Ingram, we said to him, listen, we don't like the idea of this at all. No entity can come in here and purchase it, but there's something else we don't like. If shares must be sold in this entity, the people who've built up the stock, the capital stock in Freeport County, are licensees and people, residents who live here. You should confine your purchases to those persons who were here. They were going to contribute to that. What was happening was that they were managing them to sell assets that you had already paid for to a foreigner who came and took it, and that was it. And of course, we're dealing with America now, but between the time when Southern Electric purchased it now, remember there were two others. At one point in time, your board of directors for the entity that controlled your electricity supply was sitting in Japan. But your government approved this, And don't be too harsh on the port. They recognize donkeys. And they wrote it. Don't be so harsh. They were only doing what business people do, exploiting the situation. But all along, it belonged to you. You don't have to pray that the Lord delivers it to you. He gave it to you once before, and you messed it up.
Yes.
It was always yours. We now have to come with a plan to try to, listen, don't let this agreement go to pieces. What you need to do, this is what the port doesn't want. The port does not want this agreement to be significant so that it's in place until 2024. It would rather disappear. You've got to make sure this agreement stays intact. And what you have to therefore do is to go into the courts and have the agreement declared to be existing and current and binding. And if it is, you will have then the ability to go back and say, listen, I know you've already gotten away with over 100 million, but nevertheless, to that part we can forget the past. But Freeport power, that's ours. All the monies that you see is always in Freeport.
Yes, yes.
The power monies are monies that they're having you pay, so it's to allow them to build something else at your expense, which you won't own, and out of which they will claim profits to themselves and not to you. And that's what that's all about. They never ought to have been, and if I'm right, and if the Royal Commissioners were right in September 1968, not one increase in tariff, or in fact, you've been exercised without the appropriate minister signing on it. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is, to be honest with you, I already developed the argument. What I went to the courts to try to get them to understand is we were a group of licensees, Seattle Johnson being one, who wanted to put in place, because the real secret is to put in place the non-profit body called Freeport Licensees Association. And that will allow you to receive and to take over control, so that this will be not different from some of the municipalities when you go through Florida. And you see this municipality and that, and they are self-controlling. And you will be constitutional. And you will be able to govern the way this area called, just a port area. You won't have the ability, mind you, to create another port area, but within the port area, those of us who are property owners, those of us who are licensees, you will run it. And you can set up any scheme you want that is lawful for the collection of taxes. Not in the way it's being done now, because you will be taxed by people who have never been elected to anything in this country. And if you ever want to see a classic example of taxation without representation, it's writ large here. And so next month your bill will go up, and it's only a matter of time before those of us who consider ourselves, so-called successful, we will have to close our doors, and we will continue to share employees who will not understand why it is that you don't have the income to keep them working for you. It's a sad thing. And when I can get from Freeport Power's offices the recognition that they know that there are many this night, many households that have no electricity. And it's never the case in Freeport. No, and nobody seems to understand how significant that is in terms of health and development. You have to understand that you must do some real hard things, and you may have your crusade, but you're going to have to mount a legal challenge. You're going to have to assert your claim to that which is yours. You're going to have to give up the status as just being, people on the land looking to pick up what's left for the cleaners. It's yours. The agreement, in fact, protects you. It was put in place in '55 to last for 99 years. And Sir Stafford, in his wisdom, made sure that it could last forever. You and I would long be gone, but this place would have been here. And the benefits, all of the money you pay when you come to life, we ought never, in fact, to be paying stamp duties on property under the agreement. We ought never, in fact, to be paying fees for the use of the roads as we do the road traffic. Yes. All of the money that's collected every March or whenever your birthdays goes to the Central Treasury, and that's all. That is nonsense. These are all private roads. Every now and again, when I was young and more vigorous, younger at the bar, the police would come and tell me I was moved my car from the airport. I should remind them, you can't tell me that. This is private stuff. I'm one of the owners. Of course, he would say, Mr. Glinton, I don't know, but they tell me. Of course, I understand, but I can't put up a fuss with them. These are young officers. He knows that there's no parking space, but it's private. All of these roads here are private roads. These are not government roads. If there was one government road that existed, and every town had a street highway, and that would run, as in most of these islands, every island is government. They run the West End. And where the roads didn't exist, historically, it was always a beach, That's how people used to move. From East End to West End, sometimes along the beach, on horseback or something. We don't know what it is to live on. And so you could pray and, I feel almost like Elisha said, pray to your God, maybe Elisha. We have to know the God we serve and what God expects of us as telling people. And when it is time to smite the enemy, you've got to smite him. I'm yourself. Listen, you've been very patient, very tolerant. I didn't mean to keep you this long, but I thought I would share some things with you there's so much more that you have to understand. And Ben, I do want to copy of that. Because I haven't given up on money. It takes so much time. I've done the research, and by the way, this is not a solicitation for clients, because most of these things I brought in my own name. Whenever there's always had to be something. That's what I found about this place. You've got to be prepared to do it yourself. But the whole history, see, if you see, for example, when they'll be selling all things like the airport company, now they tell you that, what's the name of the Chinese company that owns it? It's illegal. They can't own that. DEFCO owns all of that. And they were selling it, you would see letters, correspondence. I mean, where Mr. Jack and Edwin was splitting $80 million, you paid 40, just by selling off assets. You should see the correspondence. This is when this came up in the court. You'd be surprised to know what is no longer here. Mind you, it ought to be part of the trust. This, in fact, is what is called not just a breach of trust. This is really a raping of the trust. And the raping of the trust has been going on for years. And there's really nothing left, to be honest with you. There's really nothing left. But you've got to fix it.
Yes.
Yeah. You have to do it. You need to bring a representative action. And it's going to be a long struggle because many of the people who are judges have themselves been eating. We know. Some of the rapes. It's a serious situation because you've got to still have faith in your judicial system, because if it's necessary to buttress that, you've got to make sure that that's strong as well. I thank you.
Open the floor.
Yeah, that's not what we got to enjoy. But I just want
I just wanted to make one observation for those of you to show you why it is that licensees were really protected. Winston Stafford put together the first agreement with Mr. Groves. It provided that the agreement could not be amended unless 100% of all the licensees agreed, you know. It was only when you had a problem with immigration that they relented and they came to a new agreement, which is contained in the agreement of 1966. That now you still need 4/5. You cannot amend the agreement. There'll be an abrogation to the agreement over and over and over again. And we've just sat here. In fact, the agreement, in fact, has been violated repeatedly. It's become the norm. And that's why I said to you, be very careful not to ignore it. It is really your birth certificate. Do not destroy it, do not lose it. It will stay here for as long as you continue to observe it. So we must go back to court at the end of the court and have that agreement what we call specifically enforced in every respect.